I often say that Joni Mitchell is the closest thing I have to God, but this poem is the closest thing I have to Jesus. Hi besties, welcome. I hope you're doing well. Happy National Poetry Month. Ugh, April's the best. A couple people since I started this channel have asked me to do a video on poetry, and so that's what I am here to do today, and I'm so excited. I am basically going to be talking about poetry through my favorite poems and poets, and so I've divided them up into different sort of genres of poetry, and I'm going to give you some recommendations for each of those genres. I am hoping that most of these poets that I'm recommending are a good place to start with poetry. I'm sure that there are people watching this who already love poetry and they know what they like, and that's awesome, and maybe you're just looking for new recommendations, and I'm here to give those to you. But I also know of a couple people who have reached out to me saying they don't know where to start and they're sort of intimidated by poetry. And this video is for you too. So often poetry sort of carries this elitist connotation, or this idea that you have to study it and be well versed in it to understand it, and while studying it can help you understand it and help you dig into it. That absolutely does not mean that normal people like us can't enjoy it and be changed by it and fall in love with it. Some of my favorite poems have sections or sentences that I don't understand yet. I don't know if I ever will, but I know I love the words and I know I feel different after reading them. And for me, a lot of times, that's enough. I started to really get into poetry in middle school when I discovered the vast YouTube world of spoken word poetry and became obsessed. I watched hours and hours of spoken word poetry. It didn't feel like a massive barrier of analysis because I just had poets reading me their own work the way it should be read, and either I liked it and connected with it or it wasn't for me. I asked you guys on my Instagram who your favorite poets were, and you overwhelmingly said Mary Oliver, Sylvia Plath, and Wendy Cope. One of the reasons I think Mary Oliver and Wendy Cope are so popular is because I think they're a really good place to start. Their poetry feels capacious. It feels like there's space for you inside the pages and inside the words. It doesn't feel elitist or like they only want smart people reading it, which sometimes poetry feels like. But other than that, let's dive right into the recommendations. Let's start with classic poetry and get some of the dead white men out of the way. One of my first memorable experiences with poetry on the page and being really sort of unmoored by a poem that I read in class was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was a terrible person, but an amazing poet, and he really paved the way for a lot to come, so I'm still gonna mention him. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock rocked me to my core in a way that classic poetry kind of had it before. To me, it always felt a little bit inaccessible, but Prufrock felt so much like the way my thoughts exist in my head. The modernists were known for their disillusionment and their cynicism about increasing industrialization, but they also changed a lot in terms of what was expected from poetry. They, along with the Imagists and Dadaists, stripped poetry from its assumed form, but Prufrock is my favorite. The poem closes, "We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown." There is still so much in this poem that I can't fully grasp, but every time I read it, I understand a little bit more than I did before, and to me, it's just such a rewarding piece to come back to, especially when I feel sort of adrift in the universe. Robert Frost is a really popular poet, I feel like, who's absolutely stood the test of time, and my two favorite Robert Frost poems are Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which ends, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." And Birches by Robert Frost is a poem I think about all the time. Every time I see birch tree, I think about this poem. To take any one piece out of it would be to deny you the pleasure of reading it all at once for the very first time. So I will link it down below. I think it's one of Robert Frost's best. Alfred Lord Tennyson was the poet laureate of England for a very long time, and there is a reason why he was brilliant. I'm gonna be a basic bitch and tell you that my favorite Tennyson poem is Ulysses. I read this in high school with one of the best English teachers of all time. It just lit something up inside of me, and most of that came from the last few lines, which go, "We are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's a little bit longer than a lot of the ones I'll be recommending, but it's so worth it. It's beautiful. Such a great classic poem. This one might be a little bit harder to approach if you're approaching poetry for the first time. I can't really talk about classic poetry without talking about Emily Dickinson. Now, Emily Dickinson and I have a strange relationship. She's not my favorite poet. Her use of the em dash pulls me out of her poetry so frequently, and I know I should just be able to get over it, but I find it so stilted to read that I sometimes find it difficult to have any flow at all in her poetry, and so it feels very frustrating as a reader to me. That being said, I do love some of her poetry, and if I had to pick a favorite of hers, I think it would be I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, which begins, I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through, and ends, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So that does it for some of the classic poetry, some of the poetry that's sort of widely renowned and has stood the test of time. Let's move on to nature poetry, because I just really want to talk about Mary Oliver. There is a massive network for nature poetry. I fully believe that the woman doing it the best is Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver makes me look at the world around me in new and interesting ways. And if words can do that, oh my God, what a gift. If you love and appreciate nature, you will love Mary Oliver's poetry. It's very easy to grasp. Mary Oliver writes so much about the connection between humans and the natural world, but also the connection between a blade of grass and a goose. To me, there's just this beautiful dance of autonomy and identity, but also a lack of ego that she uses in her poetry that makes me just appreciate the natural world so very much. She was a queer woman and an amazing poet, and I highly recommend her work. I was trying to choose a Mary Oliver poem to share with you. I couldn't help but choose the most famous Mary Oliver poem and the one that makes its rounds on Instagram and Pinterest every couple of years, and also one of my very favorite poems of all time, and that is Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. This poem really is like an affirmation for me. When I feel overwhelmed, I think about this poem and it helps immensely. Also, a new discovery of mine is Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo is an Indigenous poet, and her work also is very focused on nature and the connection that we all have to nature. But she also writes about the plight of Indigenous people in America, the Indigenous experience. None of these poets can be pigeonholed into one specific genre because they all write about so many vastly different topics. But to me, kind of one of the standout things of Joy Harjo's poetry is the way that she writes about nature. My favorite poem I have found of hers is perhaps The World Ends Here, which begins, "The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on." And it goes on and ends with, "We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite." And I'm a sucker for any poetry or imagery or metaphor about kitchen tables, which is like such a weird and specific niche thing, but I love it when people write about kitchen tables. Like, it's because the communion and act of eating together is just so sacred and ancient and beautiful. Next, let's talk about feminist poetry. One of the poets that I immediately connected with very much was Olivia Gatwood, and she writes just so much about existing as a woman in the world and its challenges and its joys and its beauty and its ugliness, and she finds a way to sort of weave all of these things together into absolutely beautiful, beautiful work. Because Olivia is a spoken word poet, I will let her read you her poems. I will link a video of her reading some of her poems from Life of the Party down below, because why would I read them to you when Olivia can? I highly recommend her poetry. Another poet that I'm putting in this category, Ada Limon, is another poet that I feel like can't really be pigeonholed into one genre. But a lot of times when I think about her depictions of womanhood, and so that's why I put her here. But nature, friendship, love, I mean, she covers it all. I think she's so brilliant, and now anytime I see a poem by her on my feed, I have to stop what I'm doing and like have complete silence and like read it and process it, because they always just rip my heart out of my chest. Because I have her in the feminist category, I will read How to Triumph Like a Girl. I like the lady horses best, how they make it all look easy. Like running 40 miles per hour is as fun as taking a nap or grass. I like their lady horse swagger after winning. Ears up, girls, ears up. But mainly, let's be honest, I like that they're ladies. As if this big, dangerous animal is also a part of me, that somewhere inside the delicate skin of my body there pumps an 8-pound female horse heart, giant with power, heavy with blood. Don't you want to believe it? Don't you want to lift my shirt and see the huge, beating genius machine that thinks, no, it knows it's going to come in first? I think you'll love her. Let's talk about some Black poets who write a lot about the Black experience. First, I want to talk about Danez Smith. Danez Smith is Black, non-binary, queer. Their poetry is unreal. Their collection, Don't Call Us Dead, has become really big. I feel like I've seen a lot of people on BookTube talk about that collection, and it's amazing. They write so much about being Black and being queer, especially in America. The pain of those experiences, sure, but they also talk so much about the joy and beauty of those experiences. This poem that I'm about to read, I stumbled across on Instagram, and it stopped my day. It stopped my day in its tracks, because I had to read it like 3 or 4 times, because I couldn't form words about it, and I still can't, so I'm just gonna read it for you. It's called I'm Going Back to Minnesota Where Sadness Makes Sense. Oh, California, don't you know the sun is only a god if you learn to starve for her? I'm over the ocean. I stood at its lip, dressed in down, praying for snow. I know I'm strange. Too much light makes me nervous. At least in this land, where the trees always bear green. I know something that doesn't die can't be beautiful. Have you ever stood on a frozen lake, California? The sun above you, the snow and stalled sea, a field of mirror, all demanding to be the sun. Everything around you is light and it's gorgeous, and if you stay too long, it will kill you. It's so sad, you know. You're the only warm thing for miles. The only thing that can't shine. I'll be reading that poem over and over again till I die. Last in this category is one of my very favorite poets of all time. I love his words so much, and I feel very grateful that I get to live in a time in which Hanif Abdurraqib lives. I discovered Hanif in my spoken word phase and absolutely fell in love with the way that he talks and the way that he writes. It's just magical. It's electric. Like, oh, it's so good. And because he has so many poems online, I am not going to try, but I will say that my 2 favorites will be linked down below, and they are Dig Those Sunsets, Pony, and What Good Will Your Vanity Be Worth When the Rapture Comes. Do yourself a favor and look into some of it, because he writes like no one else I've ever read or heard. My last category is love poetry. First, let's talk about Wendy Cope, because so many of you already love Wendy Cope. To me, one of the beautiful things about Wendy Cope is how simply she writes. There's not a ton of analysis or overcoming you have to do to enjoy her poetry. She just really romanticizes the mundane in a way that I think is super, super special, and her poetry's still so sparkly and fun. My favorite Wendy Cope poem, and I feel like almost everybody's favorite Wendy Cope poem, is The Orange, and it goes, at lunchtime, I bought a huge orange. The size of it made us all laugh. I peeled it and shared it with Robert and Dave. They got quarters, and I had a half. And that orange, it made me so happy, as ordinary things often do just lately. The shopping, a walk in the park. This is peace and contentment. It's new. The rest of the day was quite easy. I did all the jobs on my list and enjoyed them and had some time over. I love you. I'm glad I exist. More than anybody else on this list, her poetry reminds me that moments that could be deemed small or unimportant are the moments that make up our lives, and that they're all very valuable. Also, in the love category, W.H. Auden is one of my favorite poets, and As I Walked Out One Evening is one of my favorite poems of all time. It's just this beautiful poem about a man who walks out and hears these lovers singing on the street, and most of the poem is their song. And my favorite stanza goes, "Oh, stand, stand at the window, as the tears scald and start. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart." "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart" is probably my favorite line of poetry of all time ever. And it captures the human condition like so well. Funeral Blues is also an amazing love poem about losing the person you love most in the world and how isolating and horrible that feeling is. I love the musicality that exists in all of his poems that I've read. It's like it's almost impossible not to sing them instead of just read them. Now we're done with the categories. I do have one more poem to talk about, but I couldn't figure out where it fit. It is on this, the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, we reconsider the buoyancy of the human heart by Laura Lamb Brown Lavoie. This poem in my life is like the existence of Christ. Let me explain. There is a distinct before and after. There is a before I experienced this poem for the first time, and there is an after I experienced this poem for the first time. This poem is my Jesus, and I stand by that. I can't put this poem into a box because it doesn't fit in any of these boxes I've created. It's such a singular poem. I've never read anything like it. But the concept of this poem is that a woman who is about to experience heartbreak dives down to the bottom of the ocean to talk to Titanic about what it feels like to sink. Your life will be better after you experience this poem. Besides, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart," perhaps my favorite line of poetry is, "There are enough ballrooms in you to dance with everyone you've ever loved." Like, you see what I mean? There's a before you heard that, and there's an after you heard that, and they're two different people. I would give my left arm to be able to experience this poem for the first time again. I think it's amazing, and I think it's one of the best poems ever written, and I'll die on this hill. It's a long poem. Every second of it is golden. It is my Jesus. I don't know what else there is to say. I guess all I have to say is, if you haven't read Titanic, get your fucking ass up and work. People these days don't want to work. I also very quickly have to shout out another of my favorite poets of all time, who is my best friend Flannery. I'm telling you, she's gonna be the next big deal. She recently sent me a zine that has some of her poetry in it, as well as a recipe for oatmeal that I've been meaning to try, so I'll get on that. And I asked her if I could share one of them in this video. This is one of my favorites. "Me and her, reticular, the silk of spider's web. I write her words, particular, and sew her longest threads. She knows, I am the ship. She sails across the sea, but she be the ocean too, guiding us aimlessly." Come on, Flannery, like Emily Dickinson who? Flannery Clark. Watch out for that name. It's gonna be a big deal someday. I also just wanted to give you a really rapid fire list of poetry suggestions that my besties in my Discord have given me the past few days. Isabel recommended Scheherazade by Richard Seikin, and I read it and it's wonderful. Melanie recommended An Impeccable Functional Design by Savannah Brown and What Can't Be Taken by Andrea Gibson. I love Andrea Gibson. I was so excited to see this recommendation. Daisy recommended Good Bones by Maggie Smith, which is also one of my favorites, and The Piece of Wild Things by Wendell Berry, which I also love. Katla recommended Some More Light Verse by Wendy Cope. Janina recommended The Song of the Barren Orange Tree by Federico Garcia Lorca. Amelia recommended How Water Began to Play by Ted Hughes. If you want to join our amazing Discord community, as well as see my frequent live streams and join our book club meetings at the end of each month, I will leave the link to my Patreon down below. As long as I have watched and read poetry, I have written poetry. I use poetry as a processing mechanism and a way to grapple with my feelings. I often feel like I'm wearing a backpack full of rocks when I have heavy emotions, and then I write a poem about it and I can take the backpack off. So I highly recommend that you write poetry. You don't ever have to share it with anyone. It doesn't have to be good, but it's such an amazing way to journal and sort of document times in our lives. Because April is National Poetry Month, I will share some of my poetry in my Discord. So if you're interested in that, you can click the link to my Patreon down below. We also do live streams and a book club and have an amazing and growing community on Discord that I'm already so obsessed with. I literally love y'all. You make my days brighter. Click that link down below to join our baller community. Like this video if you liked it, comment down below and tell me what your favorite poem of all time is because I want to read it. Almost half of you that watch my videos are not besties yet because you haven't hit subscribe. So if you want bestie status, hit that big red button, turn on post notifications. As always, all my socials will be linked down below, as well as all of the poems that I have mentioned in this video today. I hope you're all enjoying the new Harry Styles song, as it will be out by the time this video goes live. And in case you haven't heard it today, I love you.